love vintage. I love vintage. You love football. I love football. This is the Dandy Dozen Vintage Football Edition. Happy hobby. I'm David Goss. If you're a sports car collector and you're working with a limited budget, make sure you subscribe to this channel because that's what we do. We talk about collecting cars and buying good deals and breaking packs and breaking boxes and all stuff that's relatively affordable. Now, vintage cards aren't necessarily super affordable when you're talking about rookie cards, but what we do here at the Dandy Dozen is we talk about the players themselves, the 12 players from the vintage football era that are worth collecting. And you don't have to get their rookie card. You can get a card in any of their years of playing and you just try to improve them. Maybe you get this year one time and then next year maybe you trade that one in, sell it, take that money and buy an even younger card, an even older card, I guess I should say, earlier in his career. And you can upgrade that way, or you upgrade in what level grade his card is if you get a slab. So this is the vintage football. Now we've already done vintage baseball, we've done modern baseball, and we've done the millennials baseball, which is from the year 2000 forward. Now vintage football, it's a little different than vintage baseball because vintage football, doesn't go quite as far back as vintage baseball does. Vintage baseball goes in the 1800s, tobacco cards and all that stuff. Now our vintage baseball only went back to like 1952 tops is really where we started at. This is going to be 1955 tops football is what we're talking about basically. And we're going up to 1979. So it's the 1950s all the way through the 1970s basically is what we're considering vintage football. You might have a different definition. PSA might have a different definition. Everyone might have different. But for us, 50s to the 70s is vintage for us. Now, another reason why vintage football is a little different than vintage baseball is baseball, there's specific stats that are well known throughout sports history that everyone knows. And even stuff like a 300 hitter. If you're a 300 hitter, that means you're one of the best players. In football, it's not quite like that. A 3,000-yard passer in the 50s isn't quite that good in the 2000s, right? So a lot of that stuff has changed as more games were added, as the passing game has developed. Now, rushing's a whole different story. Running backs, very few featured running backs these days. So the game is a lot more different now than it was, let's say, even 30, 40 years ago. Okay, so let's get right into it. Vintage football, the Dandy Dozen. These are the 12 players you want to collect as a vintage football card collector. The first one, Johnny U, the golden arm, Johnny Unitas. Now he's considered basically like the Mickey Mantle of vintage football, if you think of it like that. Held most of the passing records for a few decades. One story I love about Unitas is he was a 9th round pick for the Steelers. He's from Pittsburgh. He was born in Pittsburgh. 9th round pick for the Steelers, and they ended up cutting him. He was their 4th quarterback. They cut him, released him. He went and did some other job and eventually signed on with the Baltimore Colts, who was a rival of Pittsburgh. Could you imagine if Pittsburgh had Johnny Unitas all those years? Maybe they wouldn't have drafted Terry Bradshaw, now I think about it, because their careers would have intersected. Maybe they would have, who knows? But that's just interesting to think about. Another interesting point about Johnny Unitas is this comes from oldsportscards.com. Johnny Unitas was the #1 card, the first card in the set for 5 different seasons from 1959 to 1963. That's the only time that the same player has been the #1 card in any set, in any year, in any sport for 5 consecutive seasons. Johnny Unitas. Now, what's cool for you, he's the #1 guy on my list, but he had 18 NFL seasons under his belt, so there's plenty of cards out there that you can get. Some of his older cards are relatively cheap, very cheap actually. You can find them in spots like buysportscards.com or on eBay. You can find a lot of his cards out there at decent prices. You're probably not going to find them in great condition because they are 50 years old. Now we go on to #2. Now actually #2, I kind of battled with #1 and #2. Who was going to be which? Jimmy Brown. Jim Brown from Syracuse University goes to Cleveland to become the all-time NFL rushing leader for decades. He's still considered the best running back in NFL history. He was just a powerhouse, and he basically put the team on his back and won Cleveland their last football championship before they ended up joining the NFL. Jim Brown was a Pro Bowler in every one of his 9 NFL seasons. He led the league in rushing in 8 of his 9 seasons. But you hear that, 9 seasons? That's a short career. That's a pretty short career. He had other things he wanted to accomplish. He was an activist. He ended up becoming a movie star. Starred in one of the greatest war movies of all time, The Dirty Dozen. Jim Brown. I think that was actually his last season in the NFL, and then he was in The Dirty Dozen. Another interesting point, Jim Brown was considered one of the all-time greatest lacrosse players ever. Isn't that weird? It's kind of like hearing like Michael Jordan was one of the all-time greatest beach volleyball players ever. Like it makes sense, but you're like, what? That's such a weird. How did that even? But anyways, lacrosse. While he only played in 9 seasons in the NFL, there were multiple card companies that did produce his cards: Philadelphia, Fleer, and Topps. So there are a few different versions of his cards from those 9 seasons. Now we move on to number 3, Broadway Joe Namath. He was a cultural phenomenon for the New York Jets, coming out of Alabama in the media capital of the world. He won one of the most famous football games in the history of the NFL, Super Bowl III, against the Baltimore Colts. Really put the AFL on the map with that win. And Joe just had that charisma, and that's part of what makes him a really collectible player. He's great. He was great during his NFL career, and even after. He went to broadcasting. He was in commercials. Like, he's just got that smile. And everybody, who doesn't love Joe Namath? I got that right there, Joe Namath. Now, his tall boy rookie card might be too much for your wallet, but his 1968 Topps card, which I have pictured here, you can get a decent grade on that. PSA 7, I believe, for about $250. I know that's very expensive still, but for an early card in his career, that's not bad for that grade. Now we go on to another quarterback, Bart Starr, the guy that won the first 2 Super Bowls ever. As a matter of fact, Bart Starr is the only NFL quarterback to lead his team to 3 consecutive NFL championships, including those first 2 Super Bowls. And when you think of Super Bowl wins, you think of Tom Brady. Tom Brady was the 199th pick. Bart Starr, the 200th pick for those Green Bay Packers. And much like Brady, Bart Starr was a star in the postseason, and that's kind of where his hobby legend grows as well. And now, number 5, we move on to sweetness. Walter Payton, the running back for the Chicago Bears. It's about 35 different cards produced by Topps for old Walter Payton. So you can actually find a lot of those pretty cheap. If you look on buysportscards.com, they have a lot for under $5. So that's a pretty good pickup for a top 5 collectible dandy dozen vintage football player, if you ask me. And now number 6, Terry Bradshaw, quarterback for the Pittsburgh Steelers. This guy won 4 Super Bowls. I mean, come on. Not only was he a great player and a great personality, but he parlayed that into a great persona after his NFL playing career. Now as a Fox studio analyst, like who's better than Terry Bradshaw in the studio? He's the best. His 1972 Topps rookie card is one I'm currently on the hunt for. I'm going to get one in not a very good grade, probably a 4 or 5, which is still pretty expensive. But you can get his 1973 second-year card, a decent grade, about PSA 6 for about $60. And then you mentioned Terry Bradshaw. You got to mention Roger Staubach right after that. Number 7, Roger Staubach. The Bradshaw-Staubach duel was kind of like the Tom Brady-Peyton Manning duel. Now, Staubach only played 11 years in the NFL, and he didn't play for the first 5 years after he left Navy because of his military duties. So think about how much more of a legend he could have been if he had those 5 years in the NFL. Of course, quarterbacking America's team always helps your collectability. So Roger Staubach definitely makes the list at number 7. And number 8, we move up back to the monsters of the Midway. Iron Mike Ditka of the Chicago Bears. Now, he was one of the best offensive tight ends in the 60s and early 70s with the Bears and the Cowboys. And then, of course, later on in the 80s, he became one of the best, most legendary head coaches with the Chicago Bears. That 1985 team considered one of the all-time greatest NFL teams ever. And he played in a major media market, and he was a cultural icon. And as a matter of fact, a lot of those Bears were in commercials, were in TV shows and movies. Like, they were everywhere. So that helps their collectability. Definitely helps Mike Ditka's collectability. Here we are 30 years later. So we mentioned 2 Bears already. We're making it 3. Gale Sayers, the Kansas Comet. Actually, the Chicago Bears have got a lot of collectible players through the years. although it's mostly in those 80s years. There were maybe some in the 90s, but in the past few decades, there's not a lot of people trying to collect Curtis Enos cards. But Gale Sayers was definitely he's definitely a great collectible player. An interesting story with him is in his first 2 years, his first two cards were with the Philadelphia company. So his true rookie card was a 1966 card with Philadelphia. Then 2 years later, Topps finally produced their first Gale Sayers card in 1968. That's the one I got. That's the one I kind of consider as rookie card. It's not really, but that's in my head. That's what I like to say because it's cheaper. Of course, Sayers was one of the most exciting NFL players in the league, from kick returns and punt returns and rushing, receiving. He did everything, but his career was cut short because of injuries. But it's interesting that his collectability was a little raised up a little bit more because of his role in the story of with Brian Piccolo in the movie Brian's Song. That's about Gale Sayers and his teammate, his running back teammate, Brian Piccolo. I'm not going to spoil the ending for you, but it's a sad movie. But Gale Sayers' collectability rose because of that. Number 10, scrambling, Fran Tarkenton. This guy was a superstar for the Giants and the Vikings. An 18-year NFL career, one of the all-time greatest dual threat quarterbacks. This is when there wasn't really a lot of dual threat quarterbacks. These guys were just dropping back and passing. Scrambling Fran could do just that. He came out of Georgia. He could scoot around there, and it was tough to get. And he was very exciting, a super exciting player in the 70s, which because he was so exciting, it made him a little bit more collectible, if you know what I'm saying. And then he went on in the 80s. In the early 80s, he started a TV show called That's Incredible, which in itself is pretty incredible, if you ask me. Number 11 on this list, Franco Harris. We already have 3 Bears on this list, so we might as well have 2 Steelers. We got Terry Bradshaw now as running back Franco Harris. What's interesting is Franco Harris was drafted the year after they drafted Terry Bradshaw. Franco Harris actually won the NFL, the AP Offensive Rookie of the Year award that season, 1972. And in that same season is when he caught the immaculate reception in the postseason. Was a legend. First year, that's crazy. And ever since then, he's been an ultra collectible running back from the 70s. There's not a lot of great cards to collect from the 70s, but Franco Harris's are definitely among them. All right, we get to number 12, the last one. Now, this one is a little controversial because I have 2 players that could be in this 12th spot. The one I am choosing might not be the one you choose, but the one I'm choosing is Fred Biletnikoff of the Raiders. He's one of the all-time greatest pass-catching receivers. He was known for having a little stick-em on his hands, came out of FSU, and he's the only wide receiver on our Dandy Dozen top 12 vintage football players list. He played all 14 seasons with the Raiders. He only missed 8 games. And the fact that he did it all while looking like a retired school teacher, that just makes him more collectible for me. I gotta have him. So as I was saying, the guy you might have as your 12th spot, maybe even higher, O.J. Simpson. Guy rushed for 2,000 yards, was a Heisman winner, one of the all-time greatest running backs in NFL history, was a movie star, was a TV star, went into broadcasting. But as a person in general, I'm going to pass. Obviously, his history with the law, one of the most famous trials in the history of American crime, that takes them down a notch. And a lot of people won't collect them because of that. That's how I am. So that really does bring his collectability down quite a bit. For me, no thank you. So it's interesting, though, to think about when a player's career is over. Now, they can improve their collectability, like Terry Bradshaw did, become an awesome studio analyst, but they can definitely also ruin their collectability by doing some horrible stuff off the field. Now, there are some players that were just a little too old to make this list. In other words, their cards were a little farther out of reach because they were so old. Guys like Y.A. Tittle, Frank Gifford, Norm Van Brocklin, Don Hudson, Otto Graham, Marion Motley, and Dick Night Train Lane. Those are all fantastic cards to collect if you could get them, but they didn't make this list because they're a little out of the common circulation, if you will. And then, of course, there are players that just missed this list. Guys like Raymond Berry and Paul Warfield, Archie Manning, Jack Lambert, Bob Greasy, Len Dawson, Kenny Stabler, the Snake, Lynn Swan, Dick Butkus was one I really thought about putting on here. Tony Dorsett, another one of those 80s, 70s, 80s running backs that should have been there. Steve Largent, one of the best receivers ever. Lance Allworth, Earl Campbell. What a great running back he was. Mean Joe Green, and then Paul Hornung I didn't have on here. Maybe it's just because he stole the Heisman from Jim Brown, and I'm still a little sour as a Syracuse fan. So there you have it. It's the Dandy Dozen Vintage Football Top 12 Most Collectible Players as far as I'm concerned. So I want to hear from you. Who do you think should have been in that top 12 list? Maybe there's some players I missed in the just missed category that you think I should have had. Now remember, this only goes up to the late 70s. So now some of the players you might mention, they might be in the upcoming modern era that I'm going to talk about in one of my upcoming videos. But so who are some of the cards I'm missing? Who are some of the players you think should have been in this list? Let me know in the comments below. And whatever you do, enjoy collecting your vintage cards and enjoy collecting your modern and millennials cards. Whatever you do, have a happy hobby.